Tianbao Fu Yao Lu. Chapter 197. The Aral Sea Secret Chamber. As the group continued to discuss the matter, Hung Jun gradually understood. This battle to revive his country that Atai had to face was not just a simple act of treachery, nor was it a fight to win over the hearts of the people and regain his political power. The real difficulty lay in that they would have to fight back against the divine in this process. In the Sassanid lands, Zoroastrianism had basically vanished completely and had been replaced by Islam. Divine temples had been converted into mosques, and from birth until death, generation after generation, children were raised with an unshakable belief in their new god. The records of the old gods had been destroyed, and once the written word had been destroyed, the mysteries and stories of the religion had not been able to survive for more than 50 years. The decline of Zoroastrianism started long ago, when the Isai clan had left these lands. And the Abbasids were now very unfamiliar with the Zoroastrian religion. They did not recognize the god Zoroaster, who had bestowed belief upon this land, nor did they recognize the ancient texts of the Avesta. Even the caravan members and interpreter who were making this journey with them as their cover had long since become believers in Islam. Could this battle be won? Hung Jun couldn't resist wondering. They left the Hang Pass behind and headed towards Yadan. Along the way, Hung Jun took the time to venture out and meet with his uncle, Jiazhou, after many years of being parted. Jiazhou was very worried about the Ungshi rebellion, and Hung Jun learned a great deal of information from his uncle. Li Hung had ascended to the throne and changed the era name to Zhengde. He had also allied with the Uyghurs. When they arrived in Guazhou, it just so happened that there was a large group of Uyghur troops moving in through the pass, speeding towards the central plains to help Li Hung regain the territory that he had lost. And Lushan had already fled back to Luoyang, and the Yao tribes had been quelled. Everything left was a battle for the mortals to settle. Guo Suiyi led the majority of the troops, and with the allied Uyghur forces, was preparing to break through all the way to Shan Commandery. Li Jinglong watched the Uyghur troops passing through the city below with a worried gaze. He was afraid that in driving out the wolves, they had invited tigers in instead, but the exorcism department had no right to interfere with this matter any longer. "Come," Jiazhou said. "Hung Jun, let me persuade you to drink another cup of wine, as west out of Yang Pass, there will be no old acquaintances to be found. Cheers." After Hung Jun, the exorcists, and Jiazhou finished, Jiazhou led a squad of men and personally saw them off through the pass. It wasn't until the winds began to scour the sands around them that the Tang troops finally turned and headed back. After leaving the Yang Pass behind, the road stretched, lonely and desolate, out in front of them. Along the way were large patches of the Gobi Desert, and every day or day and a half, there would be way stations where they could replenish their fresh water supplies. Many of the way stations stood empty of inhabitants, leaving only little oases in the back where the ponds were. The temperature difference between night and day was huge, and when night fell, it was so cold that a drop of water could even freeze. Hung Jun liked the night sky here. There were no mountains to block the view, and the sky was clear and cloudless for thousands of li. During the nights, he and Li Jinglong often wrapped themselves in blankets and leaned back against piles of stones, looking up at the starry river running through the sky. Qing Xiang was right. One day, Hung Jun finally couldn't resist telling Li Jinglong what had happened in the sacred land, and that was the evaluation that Li Jinglong suddenly gave. Hung Jun startled. "Did you know about it all already?" The corners of Li Jinglong's mouth quirked up slightly. "I guessed." Hung Jun sighed. "Sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned this to you." "No," Li Jinglong replied. "If you hadn't said, then you would have missed many things hidden in the details." Hung Jun asked, "Could I have missed something?" "Anyways, as long as I'm alive, I won't agree to any suggestions they make on this issue." "Who?" Li Jinglong asked. Hung Jun, "Of course it's the 4 great Yao kings." Li Jinglong replied, "Did the 4 Yao kings all acknowledge him?" When Hung Jun was asked that, he instantly sensed something. Li Jinglong continued casually, when I say that Qing Xiang did things right, I wasn't referring to the words he said about the Yao tribes replacing the human race and creating their eternal empire. I was referring to how he didn't force you to make a decision. This is very important. That's because Feng Er appeared, Hung Jun explained. Back then, when I saw his eyes, I even felt things were a little dangerous. But Li Jinglong waved a hand. Feng Er just so happened to give him a way to step back. When you think back on it, the moment that Qing Xiang proposed what he did, how did the four Yao kings react? Hung Jun replied, none of them wanted to. When he got to this point, the corpse ghost king and Yu Zayun's reactions swiftly ran through his head. The two Yao kings had moved to speak but had stopped themselves, while the Kun god remained silent. It was this that helped Hung Jun understand Li Jinglong's hypothesis. The Kun god was helping him, Li Jinglong replied easily. It's impossible that the two of them wouldn't know what the other is thinking. Hung Jun pondered for a moment, before nodding. Li Jinglong continued, as for the Fox King and the Ghost King, I don't believe that they agree with Qing Xiang's choice. But they are not on friendly terms with Yaojin Palace, Hung Jun said. I feel like, the Ghost King still feels, relatively friendly towards the humans, at least more so than Chongming. Yu Zayun, I actually feel, was previously in love with the old emperor. This is exactly where the issue lies, Li Jinglong said. That's why they would never choose to have Qing Xiang as the new king of all the Yao, because according to Qing Xiang, they are closer to the humans. Having you as their leader is something that they can all accept. You are born of Yaojin Palace, so you have deep ties with Qing Xiang and Yuan Kun. You are Chongming's successor, and you are also my. When he got to this point, Li Jinglong chuckled. You are also the Madame Marchioness. Hung Jun nodded, his face a little red. Perhaps. The Kun god and Qing Xiang both understand clearly, Li Jinglong continued, that from the perspective of the majority, only you can gather again the four great Yao kings and build a new sacred land. Otherwise, Yuan Kun wouldn't have asked me for a corpse and a soul. Hung Jun was slowly starting to understand. Li Jinglong continued, if Qing Xiang forced you to make a decision, the Yao tribes would inevitably be at odds with each other once more. Feng Er seemed to have interrupted your conversation, but it actually gave Qing Xiang a way to step back. Hung Jun was silent, his forehead deeply furrowed. Li Jinglong said in conclusion, sometimes, I even suspect that Yuan Kun is the driving force behind Qing Xiang, and he's the one who's influencing your decisions. Yangtze also often said that the Kun god's intentions are too hard to read. Hung Jun said, it's not to that point yet, is it? The entire reason I could survive is because of Yuan Kun. Li Jinglong nodded at that, and he stopped speaking. Hung Jun searched his thoughts before continuing. There will always be a way to resolve things slowly, as long as the two of us are together. Speaking of which, it seems to be getting colder and colder. Are you cold? The two of them curled up under the wool blanket. Inside the blankets, Li Jinglong undid Hung Jun's clothes and touched his skin, whispering, let me warm you up. Li Jinglong's naked body was like a burning furnace, and every time he wrapped himself around Hung Jun, touched him and entered, Hung Jun felt impossibly happy. After leaving the Yang Pass behind, the exorcists at first held a meeting every day, but towards the second half of their journey, they had said basically all they had to say, so they each stayed within the carts, hiding from the heat. Though it was almost the 10th month, the Silk Road was still blazing with heat. It was hard for the two of them to be intimate during the day, because even after rubbing up against each other a few times they'd be sticky with sweat. But Lu Su had once told Hung Jun about a method where instead of being afraid of the heat, it would be better for him to ignore it. Hung Jun tried it out, and it did lend a different flavor to their activities. The two of them entwined around each other in the cart, both sweating heavily. Li Jinglong's back, shoulders, and chest were all covered with sweat, which gave off a scent of power and masculinity and made Hung Jun's blood run hot. As soon as they started, they basically could never stop. Of course, this type of play was locked behind a specific requirement, which was that they had to wash themselves off every day. Thankfully, towards the second half of the Silk Road, every way station had an adequate water source, so at twilight, everyone could take a bath. After the bath, they would then smear a bit of perfume over themselves, and Hung Jun finally understood why the Simu people and the people of the western region smelled so strongly of perfume. Hung Jun, Lu Su whispered into Hung Jun's ear, gently shaking him. Come with me to a place. Hung Jun blearily got up and looked at Lu Su. He changed into his clothes, still woozy with sleep as he followed him out. Where are we going? Hung Jun asked. Lu Su continued to walk forward. Bazhin city was very small, and instead of calling it a city, it would be more accurate to call it a village. It was composed of some 10 or so rammed earth houses, with their doors open to allow for passing merchants to do business. There were 2 roads, one vertical and one horizontal, forming a cross. There was no city wall outside, and there were only 10 or so villagers that lived there at a time. Most of the people were passing merchants. Past the rear of the city, after climbing over a hill, they reached the Aral Sea. There was a tall mountain on the western side of the Aral Sea, with an odd structure built on it. Hung Jun came back to himself, and he gazed at that structure from afar. Lu Su said, I'll take you, let's go up. And saying that, he transformed into the white deer. On a sunny afternoon, they flew across the Aral Sea, parting the waves as they went, flying towards the top of the mountain. Where is this place? Hung Jun asked curiously. Kyangur and Atai's former home, the white deer replied. Hung Jun remembered. Atai had mentioned it before, that one of the temples of Zoroastrianism was located on the high mountain right by the Aral Sea. That had once been a place where Zoroaster had spread his teachings, and it had later been built into a temple. Atai and Kyangur were both born in this temple, Lu Su said, walking side by side with Hung Jun into that ruined temple. Weeds filled the space now. Turandukt and Atai also met here. How do you know so much? Hung Jun cleared away the overgrown creeping vines before pushing open that door. Lu Su, Kyangur told me. Hung Jun, oh ho. What do you mean by oh ho? Lu Su asked expressionlessly. I mean what it means on the surface, Hung Jun said, glancing questioningly at Lu Su. Do you guys often secretly chat with each other? Lu Su, we don't. And what do you mean by secretly? When we get assigned to a task together, we'll chat with each other a little. Ashinakayan had never told Hung Jun about his past, probably because Li Jinglong and Hung Jun were together. Atai had often warned Ashinakayan not to make any trouble for himself, so Ashinakayan had exercised much restraint. He didn't even make many jokes about Hung Jun, and in the past, he would tease Lu Su a little, but now he didn't even dare to touch Lu Su. Staying cooped up in the exorcism department day in and day out, however, was also stifling. Hung Jun, he can go flirt with Zhao Zilong. Lu Su. Hung Jun actually liked Ashinakayan a lot. Not only him, he felt that every one of his comrades was very dependable, and each and every one of them would risk it all for the sake of their comrades. When Lu Su walked towards the sacrificial altar, Hung Jun had mostly understood what was happening. You want to understand him, Hung Jun said. No, Lu Su denied. You're overthinking it. I simply feel that he's a little. There were a large amount of murals plastered across the walls of the sacred hall, depicting Zoroaster spreading his teachings as well as telling the fairy tales of ancient Persia. The two of them stood shoulder to shoulder and looked at it for a bit, before Lu Su finished his sentence. Lonely. Hung Jun frowned slightly at that. Lu Su continued, but this is not my goal. Zenchi simply wanted me to check and see if Kyangur could be one of the 6 bearers of the artifacts. After all, He and Atai were both born here. Hung Jun looked into every corner of the divine hall, including the cemetery behind the mountain. An epigraph had been inscribed there in Persian. Neither of them understood what it said, but Hung Jun suddenly found a place with a symbol that matched the symbol embroidered onto Atai's robe. The high priestess, Hung Jun said, was Li Guiyan and Atai's Shifu. See if there are any lovers, Lu Su said. Since this is such an important thing, why aren't Jinglong and the rest of them coming themselves? At this time, Li Jinglong, Qiu Yangxi, and Mo Rijin were asking around about Atai's movements. The facts proved that Atai had come to Barzan City, and had even met with a specific person here. According to Li Jinglong's predictions, it was very likely that individual had been Amonherkadu. But Atai and Ashinakayan had not returned to the place they were born before they quickly left. Lu Su and Hung Jun's task was to see if there were any earth vein entrances or exits in this place. Technically speaking, there shouldn't have been any. However, as soon as Hung Jun and Lu Su were given a task to carry out together, the two of them loved to chat about anything and everything idly. Sometimes they would talk about Qiu Yangxi, sometimes they would talk about Ashinakayan, Mo Rijin, and Li Jinglong, but the odd thing was that they weren't very interested in Atai at all. Perhaps it was because they thought he was even prettier than a girl that they didn't have much interest in him. The sacred flame had already been extinguished, and there was no way to relight it. Several braziers were covered in the leftover traces of fires that had once burned there. Lu Su suddenly said to Hung Jun, "Come and take a look at this." Hung Jun went inside a room. Sunlight shone in from the cracks at the top of the garden. This was a very classically styled Persian courtyard, with several small fountains situated in the center. Lu Su pointed out, "Look at these two statues. The left side of one and the right side of another are both very polished, as if someone has forcefully turned them." Hung Jun thought, what kind of people are you all, to spot even the tiniest differences like these? He reached out, and with Lu Su helping, moved the statues. The moment both of them began to turn, the ground suddenly rumbled and sank, revealing a passageway. "Wow," Hung Jun said. "Is there treasure?" The two of them scratched their heads, before Hung Jun led the way in. Within the dark space, Hung Jun snapped his fingers and created a small flame in his hand, which lit up that underground chamber. The underground chamber was completely empty except for the door at the other end. Behind the door was a gloomy passageway that stretched into the darkness, leading even deeper underground. Hung Jun calculated the steps they had taken, before saying quietly, "We should be under the RLC here." Lu Su suddenly stumbled. He had tripped over something, and both of them looked down at the same time. The light shone on a person's face. Hung Jun and Lu Su yelped at the same time. That was a man bound with ropes, his hair loose and in disarray, his entire body covered in blood. Hung Jun asked, "How could someone end up here? Is he dead? Let's see." Hung Jun patted that man's cheek, moving his blood-covered hair out of the way. A familiar face appeared, with a beard that had evidently not been touched up for many days and cracks at the corners of his eyes. He was skinny beyond belief, and his fingers had all been broken. Hung Jun. Lu Su. End chapter. Tianbao Fu Yao Lu. Chapter 198. An old friend in peril, again. Li Jinglong slammed the door open as he, Qiu Yangxi, and Mo Rijin charged inside. Hung Jun was checking Ashinakayan's condition, while Lu Su was wiping his body down with a wet cloth. Ashinakayan had evidently been subject to some inhumane torture, before finally being discarded in that dark, sunless tunnel. If it hadn't been for Lu Su's coincidental idea, then perhaps Ashinakayan would have gone missing just like that. He was running a high fever, in combination with a severe amount of blood loss. Hung Jun forced medicine and pills down his throat in equal measure, and even searched through Barzan City for rare medicinal herbs before using safflower, snow lotuses, and other similar spiritual medicines to make a mixture to treat him with. Can you wake him first? Li Jinglong asked. I only want to ask him 3 questions, and after I'm done, Mo Rijin and I will go search for Atai, while you two remain here to look after him. That won't do, Hung Jun frowned, shaking his head. Aside from his injuries, he's also been poisoned. What poison? Mo Rijin checked Ashinakayang's pulse for him. Hung Jun hummed, before saying, either way, we have to first cleanse him of the poison. Ashinakayang remained unconscious throughout all of this, his body riddled with wounds. Finally, Chiu Yangxi said, when will he be able to wake up, approximately? Give us a time range. At the quickest, 3 days, Hung Jun replied helplessly. At the latest, 10 days. He's not as heavily injured as you were, Lu Su said. He'll be able to live. There's no danger to his life. Back when Li Jinglong had been facing off against Mara, he had destroyed basically all of his meridians. Most of Ashinakayang's wounds, in comparison, were only external. The only issue was that his vitality had been greatly depleted. Mo Rijin studied Ashinakayang, before saying, why does he look like those dead people from the Fox Yao case in Chang'an, the ones who had been sucked dry? That's just what a loss of vitality looks like, Hung Jun replied expressionlessly. Don't ask any more questions. The energy within the body, the meridians, strength, and so on were considered the vitals, and the vitals were further split into yin vitals and yang vitals. Why would he lose vitality? Li Jinglong persisted. I must know. Don't hide any details from us. Hung Jun threw up his hands. All right then. The reason he lost so much of his vitality is because they fed him a type of medicine. It's not technically a poison, but it's a very vicious medicine, because it'll force him to constantly do that. Come, Lu Su supplied tersely. Li Jinglong immediately understood, and based on the type of medicine, the group perceptively teased out some details about the situation. Li Jinglong, Chiu Yangxi and Mo Rijin then began to analyze those details. They ran into Aman in Barzan, Li Jinglong said. Evidently, Kayang and Atai trusted that guy at first. Mo Rijin continued. But halfway through their discussions, they discovered that things weren't right, and in a guarded fashion as well. Chiu Yangxi paced a little in the room, pondering. One ran away, and one got caught. Kayang purposefully stayed behind to guard their backs, Li Jinglong said. Atai should still be safe. Li Jinglong was basically sure that Ashinakayang and Aman had once had many emotional disputes, and it was likely that the warrior Aman had expressed his love, only for Ashinakayang to reject him. In the end, his love turned into hate. Of course, what actually happened was not as simple as what Li Jinglong had sketched it out to be. He likes how these two look, Mo Rijin replied casually. More likely than not, that Aman or whatever guy has already gone insane. Ashinakayang had always liked beautiful young men, and he was never very interested in warrior men who bristled with strength and power and seeped masculine energy from head to toe. In the end, could Aman have betrayed them because of a reason such as didn't you want to be on top? He then fed Ashinakayang an aphrodisiac and trapped him in the dungeon, whipping him all over with a leather whip until he was covered in wounds, before calmly studying how he looked while in pain and constantly shuddering from coming constantly. Finally, with his vitality all depleted, he would lose all his strength and die. The pleasures of the bed were truly very beautiful, but using them to wring a person dry was very cruel. Based on this point alone, Li Jinglong came to a general conclusion about Aman's personality, as well as the complicated feelings he felt for Kayang. But no matter what, Chiu Yangxi said, compared to being handed over to Baghdad and being stoned to death, sending him on his way with a powerful aphrodisiac is still, a way of dying painlessly. Hung Jun and Lu Su were immediately struck dumb at that. They could never have imagined that, through this medicine alone, the group could have come up with the entire series of events. I must find where Atai has gone, Li Jinglong decided. Who will come with me? Hung Jun has to remain behind to take care of Kyung and take him with the caravan when they start traveling again. We'll meet again in Talas. Since they had found one of them, and they also knew the general gist of what had happened, everyone felt slightly more comforted. They decided that Chiu Yangxi would stay, and he, Hung Jun and Lu Su would look after Ashina Kyung, while Li Jinglong and Mo Rijin would head out first to search for any clues. That night, the two of them set off on their journey, and the next morning, Hung Jun and the rest brought Kyung along as they set off. The Aral Sea stretched out in front of them, its borders invisible to the naked eye. Though it was a huge, landlocked lake, it was still called a sea. Hung Jun and the rest of the group set off again, heading westward along the shore of the sea, before turning southwest. Though Li Jinglong wasn't with them, Chiu Yangxi was keeping them company, ensuring that if something unexpected happened, Hung Jun and Lu Su would have someone to discuss the situation with at the very least. After entering the Aral Sea region, the rivers grew very abundant in number, and along the way they passed large swathes of floodplains. Reeds and cattails flourished along the banks of the lake. Wild oxen accompanied the caravan in droves, not at all afraid of the caravan. Hung Jun was keeping the soundly asleep Ashina Kyung company when Lu Su suddenly shouted, "Hung Jun! Quick! Look! So many elephants!" Hung Jun thought at first that some Yaogwai had appeared, but instead, he heard the earth thundering below them as a herd of elephants crossed the floodplains in a line. Previously, in Chang'an, he had seen the elephants that Li Longji was raising, but he had never seen so many elephants at once. The appearance of the elephants meant that they were already once again approaching the lands of the Fertile Crescent. The caravan came to a stop to let the elephant herd pass. It was right then that Ashina Kyung opened his eyes. By coincidence, Hung Jun turned his head, and he let out a shout of uncontainable joy. "Yangxi Gur! Lu Su! He's awake!" Chiu Yangxi immediately came over, and the three of them surrounded Ashina Kyung. Ashina Kyung said tiredly, "I feel alive again. Xiao Luo, I knew that you would enter the hidden hall to search for me." Ashina Kyung hid nothing from Hung Jun either, telling him the entire truth. Amon had once loved him, and had therefore borne a grudge for Atai in his heart. It was also because of this that Ashina Kyung had always believed in Amon. Though he had rejected Amon a few times, he still thought that Amon would never begrudge Kyung for his friendship with Tegla. And it was thus that in Barzan city, Ashina Kyung and Atai were betrayed. Amon brought him into the sacred hall and let him choose a way to die, in order to spare him from being handed over to General Bayat in Baghdad, where he would be stoned to death. Ashina Kyung chose the secret hall deep in the Zoroastrian temple, which was where the sacred flame had once been worshipped. Chiu Yangxi glanced at Lu Su, asking, "You guys even chatted about that place in the past?" Ashina Kyung said, "I told Atai to leave first, because either way death was coming. Compared to letting Amon tie me to a stone and toss me into the Aral Sea, I figured I might as well see if there was a possibility that you guys would come rescue me." So with that, Amon fed Ashina Kyung a powerful aphrodisiac and stripped him bare, tossing him into the dungeon. He then watched on as Ashina Kyung spent all the vitality in his body and fell into a coma, before shutting the great doors of the secret chamber. "I've gone through almost everything I've stored up in this life," Ashina Kyung said, torn between laughing and crying. "I probably won't be able to get it up again in the future." "That won't be the case," Hung Jun replied, amused. "I fed you several medicines that will greatly recover the yang essence in you. It's just like how a fierce battle saps the strength. Once you recover, you'll only be more powerful." All of them couldn't resist laughing loudly at that, and Ashina Kyung looked at Lu Su and Hung Jun gratefully. Chiu Yangxi told him to rest for a while, and when twilight fell, Ashina Kyung could manage to sit up by himself. Chiu Yangxi then confirmed his and Atai's plans to him. "Tegla needs to relight the sacred flame of Talas," Ashina Kyung said. "But that drew Bayat instead. The golden ring is in Bayat's hands. Who told you that? Chu Yangxi asked. Aman, Ashinakayang said, after pondering for a moment. When they first ran into Aman, Atai had gained this key piece of information. Though he couldn't quite confirm if this information was true or not, they at least had a clue to work off from. It won't be a lie, Chu Yangxi said. Because he was luring you two into a trap, there was no need for Aman to lie about something like this. Back in the day, Ba'at killed Tagla's father, Ashinakayang explained after letting out a sigh. Baghdad's defenses are numerous, and with our strength alone, it's impossible to break through the guards there and get close to him. If Atai could light the sacred flame in Talas, however, that would draw Ba'at out. He would definitely come to deal with the last scion of the Isai clan himself. Aman wanted us to sneak into his personal guards, and take the opportunity to cut off his hand and steal back the golden sun ring. This did sound like a completely flawless scheme, but in the end, they had still fallen to Aman's hands. Chu Yangxi asked, "Where is the blood I gave you?" Ba'at found it and took it with him, Ashinakayang replied. An idea came to Chu Yangxi, and he said, "We might be able to find some way to use that to our advantage, wait for a bit. Rest first." Lu Su patted Ashinakayang's shoulder. "Let it go." Lu Su and Chu Yangxi left, leaving Hung Jun to keep Ashinakayang company. Ashinakayang no longer had a smile on his face at all times. In fact, he had maintained his silence throughout this twilight discussion. The caravan moved forward a little more, already preparing to make camp for the night. Hung Jun studied Ashinakayang, and their eyes met amidst the twilight. Ashinakayang seemed to be a little at a loss for words again, so Hung Jun said, "The feeling of being betrayed is very terrible." Ashinakayang smiled helplessly. "It's not like you've been betrayed before." "How haven't I?" Hung Jun asked. "Zhao Zilong ah." Ashinakayang startled, before he laughed loudly and shook his head. Hung Jun thought for a moment, before continuing, "Despite losing a once close friend, you still have Atai, Yangxi, and us." Ashinakayang replied, "What makes me shudder is that Aman has already changed." Hung Jun didn't interrupt, instead remaining silent as he listened. The sky gradually darkened, and the side profile of Ashinakayang's face formed a blurred silhouette. Amidst the last of the light, he spoke. He said, that the new God that he believed in had already purified his inner heart. Those impure emotions had all been cleansed and burned away in a fiery hell. He said that we are all sinners, Ashinakayang said, lost in thought. Because despite having all those women to love, we actually ended up loving men. Hung Jun immediately replied, "You have not sinned, nor have we." Ashinakayang ed in the darkness. Hung Jun suddenly asked, "Kayang, do you like?" "I don't," Ashinakayang replied. "I have never loved Xiao Lu, though I truly envy you guys. I envy you and Zhenji, and Xiao Lu and Dalan." From these words, Hung Jun suddenly sensed a wave of deep loneliness. He climbed through the carriage and hugged Ashinakayang, who leaned very gently against his shoulder. The two of them were silent for a moment, before they separated again. "You will run into someone you'll love," Hung Jun said, smiling in the darkness. His eyes, however, were very bright. "When that day comes, you will no longer feel as if you have sinned." "I believe you," Ashinakayang replied. The merchants carried their parcels, big and small, out of the carts. They lit fires along the dry riverbed, when a faint, odd cry suddenly sounded in the distance. Ashinakayang and Hung Jun were slumped against the carriage when Lu Su climbed in and asked, "What was that noise just now? Did you hear that?" Hung Jun's ears were not as keen as Li Jinglong's, Lu Su's, or Morigin's, but when Lu Su asked him that, he did seem to feel discomfited. "I'll go take a look," Lu Su decided. "Yangxi Gur will stay here and guard you, so if anything comes up just shout for him." Hung Jun offered, "I'll go with you." But Lu Su waved his hand and leaped off the carriage. Down on the ground, the merchants had started lighting campfires, and Qiu Yangxi lit a lamp, studying the map under the lamplight. In another 3 days, they would arrive in Talas, but ever since they galloped away from Barzan, they hadn't heard anything from Li Jinglong and Mo Rijin. The floodplain changed as soon as night fell. The wind howled and sobbed as it gusted towards them, and in the darkness, the riverbed seemed to hide a huge beast. The fires that the merchants lit were blown out by the wind, and they tried several times more. The temperature dropped, so Hung Jun wrapped Ashina Kyung in a rug, before scooting in next to him and pressing a hand against his skinny arm, helping him get warm. Back then, I thought that I'd never see everyone again, Ashina Kyung added. What were you thinking of, in your last moments? Hung Jun asked. Nothing at all, Ashina Kyung replied. It seemed as if no one was waiting for me to return. Just as Hung Jun was about to say, how could that be, Ashina Kyung lifted a finger and made a hush gesture. He sang quietly, the leaves, will always leave the branches when autumn arrives. Friends, will always part company one day, each going his own way. Only my lover is waiting for me to finish fighting this war, and return to those distant lands. I have no lover, nor do I have any regrets, Ashina Kyung said calmly. If I've guessed correctly, in your final moments you definitely thought of Zenji, isn't that right? Where's Lu Su? Qiu Yangxi asked, climbing into the cart. He hasn't come back yet. Hung Jun also began to grow wary. With Lu Su's speed, he usually wouldn't spend more than half a shishan scouting out the road in front of them. We can't light the fire, the merchants down beneath the cart said. The wind's too strong. Let's manage for the night in the carts. Everyone get in. Hung Jun hurriedly called. Climb onto my cart. Qiu Yangxi let down the curtain, saying in return, I'll go look for Xiao Lu. The merchants gathered by the carriage, and Qiu Yangxi spoke a few sentences to them that there were exorcists in the carriage, and they could relax. He then went off to search for Lu Su. Dark clouds covered the night sky, and it was so dark you couldn't see your outstretched hand in front of you. A cold wind crept into their bones, and despite Hung Jun inviting the merchants into the carriage, they all felt very awkward about it and didn't want to climb on and disturb them. Instead, they chose to move all the carts to one area, before gathering in the center, by one of the large carts, drinking strong wine. Ashina Kyung came back to his senses, and he said, Hung Jun, I keep feeling like something isn't quite right. Hung Jun also grew wary. Lu Su's speed was very extraordinary, and all of the martial arts in the world would not be able to stand in the face of that speed, so he wasn't worried about him. In reality, in the exorcism department, the only person who hadn't really been injured until now was Lu Su. Don't worry. Hung Jun called up the pentacolor sacred light to cover the caravan, preventing the horses from running off. He held his 4 throwing knives in his hands, tilting his head to listen to the movements outside. End chapter. Tianbao Fu Yao Lu. Chapter 199. An enemy, not a friend. Tell them to leave the carts, Ashina Kyung said. Hung Jun replied, it's easier to protect everyone when they're together, right? Do as I say, quickly. Ashina Kyung said. Hung Jun knew that every member of the exorcism department was very experienced in battles, and many times, all he had to do was to follow what they said. Ashina Kyung had once been a personal bodyguard of the Isai family, so if that was what he had judged to be the best course of action, then there must be a reason for it. Everyone, hide. Hung Jun climbed out of the carriage to notify the merchants. At almost the same time, there was a sharp woo in the distance, before the sound of thousands of men and horses thundering across the field rang out. What's that? Hung Jun peered into the night, only to see what looked like a vast army charging towards them. Ashina Kyung shouted, hide behind the rocks. The head of the caravan shouted back, there's at least 10,000 people. The thundering drew closer and closer, as if they were right in front of them. Yet Hung Jun had already witnessed the vast armies camped out in front of Chang'an city, so how could he be afraid of these mere 10,000 people? With a wave of his left hand, he called upon the pentacolor sacred light, and with his right hand, he raised his 4 throwing knives, which hovered in the air. He readied himself to use the sacred light to fend off the first wave of attackers. The caravan was instantly pulverized, before there came bursts of elephants trumpeting. Ashinakayan shouted something from behind him, but Hung Jun couldn't hear anything any longer. Soon after, a herd of elephants trampled recklessly by, and one stepped on him as they went. This was the first time that Hung Jun had felt the sensation of being trod upon by elephants, and he found himself speechless. Despite the legend that the pentacolor sacred light could bear the weight of Mount Tai, at the heart of it, its limitations were set by the wielder's physical strength. If Mount Tai really did come crashing down, all of them would be squashed flat. That weight made it so that Hung Jun couldn't even shout in the moment before he was bowled over onto the ground. In the distance, Ashinakayan shouted something, like he was reminding him of fire. With that, Hung Jun summoned up the last of his strength and sent out some flames. A pillar of fire went blazing into the sky, and the elephant herd immediately scattered in fright, crashing this way and that. The pressure on him, however, immediately lessened. He had almost gone in the wrong direction, and it wasn't until the horse carts began to burn that he could tell that several elephants had dragged the horse carts off, racing towards the southwest. Hung Jun went chasing after the horse carts, only to see that Ashinakayan was still on one of them. Thankfully, the number of elephants had decreased, so Hung Jun began to dive downwards towards the earth. But it was right then that things changed. A black shadow came flying at him from the ground, intercepting Hung Jun's path down as it collided heavily with him. Hung Jun had been flying along at a high speed, and he didn't have the pentacolor sacred light protecting him, so he took the blow solidly to the chest. Instantly, he spat up a mouthful of blood, and as the drops went flying, he saw a bony claw appear in front of him, going right for his eyes. Hung Jun cast one of his protective throwing knives out, but the clawed hand actually grabbed it out of thin air. There was a quiet "oh" in the darkness, before Hung Jun shouted, "Who's there?" As he shouted, that black shadow turned once again in the air and kicked at him sideways. Hung Jun ended up taking that blow as well, a solid thud to the chest, and his breath roiled. That black shadow then came pressing in, grabbing him by the throat. But in that same moment, another shadow suddenly came dashing past, parrying Hung Jun's enemy for him. A clear voice shouted, "Go!" Hung Jun plummeted down to the ground. The herd of elephants had already scattered, leaving the carts burning away in the center. He staggered towards them, and as he ran, he looked up at the sky, but both figures had already vanished. Hung Jun. Ashinakayan hobbled out of the cart. Hung Jun's vision darkened. First, an elephant had stepped on him, then he had been the victim of an ambush, and that last kick almost made his innards explode. But who was his mysterious savior that had suddenly appeared? That voice had been rich and deep, and it hadn't resembled that of any member of the exorcism department. Furthermore, when they had been trading blows, all three of them had been swiftly flying through the air. The warrior behind him actually knew how to fly as well, so did he have magic? Hung Jun. Hung Jun. In a reversal of the usual, Ashinakayan actually grabbed Hung Jun and steadied him. Their surroundings were pitch black, and Hung Jun had bouts of dizziness that came and went. If it had been someone else who suffered such a beating, they would have had to stay in bed for at least 3 days. But the true power of the phoenix in him had come in handy, and it was swiftly repairing his body. "Come this way." Hung Jun's head spun, and he and Ashinakayan helped each other along as they ran into the darkness. All that was left on the plains were the burning horse carts. In a cave, with elephants trumpeting outside not too far away, Ashinakayan watched Hung Jun worriedly. After a long while, Hung Jun managed to recover. His innards had recovered very swiftly, and in a few moments, he was already able to speak. But when he breathed, his dantian still throbbed with pain. "What is this place?" Hung Jun asked tiredly. "Somewhere in the mountains," Ashinakayang replied. "You vomited up quite a lot of blood." Hung Jun waved a hand, indicating that he was all right. Ashinakayang continued, "I was afraid that you'd lose your way, so I lit the carts on fire." Hung Jun nodded, before describing the heated battle in the air to Ashinakayang. After hearing that, Ashinakayang sank into a thoughtful silence, frowning deeply. "Was it a helper that you all hired?" Hung Jun asked. For a mysterious ally of unknown origin to show up so suddenly, and one with such powerful skills at that, the only explanation was that they were a friend of Ashinakayang and Atai. Ashinakayang racked his brains for a long time, however, before shaking his head, saying, "Among our allies, basically no one can fly." Late into the night, odd sounds still sounded outside from time to time. Ashinakayang asked, "Can you move? Come, get up. We shouldn't stay here for long, the enemy won't let us off the hook so easily." Hung Jun managed to get to his feet. "We can't go outside. The enemy has the ability to see in the night, and they can see exceptionally clearly at that." For Hung Jun to be struck by such an ambush in the darkness meant that it was possible their enemy, while keeping an eye on their movements, wasn't using their eyes at all. After a brief silence, Ashinakayang said, "Let's stick to the foot of the mountain as we go." The black clouds dissipated, revealing this place as a jagged, towering mountain of stone. The mountain was covered in wild weeds, and cold winds gusted by. Ashinakayang and Hung Jun walked along in the dark, only for Hung Jun to suddenly remark, "Such strong evil energy." The Milky Way appeared in the sky above, and the dark night grew a little brighter. Hung Jun added, "We have to get back to the horse cart as soon as we can." Ashinakayang replied, "Let's head north." Despite being hastily forced to flee, Ashinakayang had still kept track of where they were heading. They had to circle around this stone mountain before they could return to the plains, and at the same time, they had to be wary of that unknown enemy of theirs that could appear at any moment. The harsh weak glow of the stars that shone through the dark night seemed to lend the stone mountain an unspeakable air of uncanniness. Hung Jun suddenly stopped. He felt as if he had seen the exact same scene before, somewhere else. No calls of the bugs, no sounds of water. This place had an aura of death hanging over it, and the silence here was horrific. Where had that other place been? Countless memories tumbled through his head. It had been just a little bit ago. Tianluo Mountain. Tianluo Mountain, where the Ba snake had taken up residence, was almost exactly the same as this place was. "Ashinakayang, what's wrong?" "There's a Yaoguai here," Hung Jun said. "We can't pass through here, we must leave quickly." Any place with an aura of death meant that a very powerful Yaoguai lived here, and also that the Yaoguai in question was venomous. Ashinakayang carried Hung Jun along, but just as they turned, a hoarse voice spoke from behind them. I raced along fruitlessly in pursuit, that voice rasped. "I never expected you to fall into my hands so easily at that." The black grit beneath their feet rose up like a dense swarm of bugs, transforming into the shape of a human. That Yaoguai's claws were wickedly sharp, and its nails were stained with blood. Its skin was weathered and leathery, and it stood quietly there. It was about 1.5 of Hung Jun's height, and it seemed to be a little hunchbacked as it studied Hung Jun. That was the same enemy that had attacked him in the air previously. "Drought Fiend?" Hung Jun asked, his voice trembling. "You know him?" Ashinakayang didn't know about what the Corpse Ghost King had told him. He was very weak in this moment, but he still gripped his throwing knives in his hand, moving to block that Yaoguai as he always had done. "That's correct, I am the Drought Fiend," the Drought Fiend said darkly. "Come, hand over your body." "Wait." Hung Jun hurriedly said. "I bring a letter from the Ghost King. I am the Yao King of the Central Plains." The Drought Fiend cackled coldly, and his lips cracked as he roared, "What I want is your blood, Yao King." And with that, the drought fiend pounced forward. He was even a little faster than Lu Su, and when he dashed forward, Hung Jun was completely unprepared. He originally thought that if they found the Yaoguai's lair, they could avoid a fight. He hadn't thought that the drought fiend would ignore his old acquaintance entirely and move right to killing them. With a single blow, Ashinakayan fell to the ground. Hung Jun called out the pentacolor sacred light, which slammed right into the Yaoguai's blow, but then, the pentacolor sacred light shattered under one swipe of the drought fiend's sharp claws. Hung Jun. The pentacolor sacred light had been shattered. From the day that Hung Jun had set foot in the human realm onwards, he had used the pentacolor sacred light countless times. Mahamayuri was, after all, one of the embodiments of Mara, and only the power of a god or a devil could defeat him. But even then, it was only to the level of being defeated. The pentacolor sacred light had never been so soundly shattered before. The moment the light shattered, Hung Jun leaned backwards. This movement saved his life, and flying bugs shot out from the drought fiend's claw, clawing their way towards his neck. In the next moment, the drought fiend's other claw moved in as well. But there was another flash from behind Hung Jun, and with a loud cry, someone blocked the drought fiend's sharp claw from landing. Hung Jun fell to the ground, his eyes wide as he looked at this ally that had once again appeared so unexpectedly. A man appeared in front of him. That man was 8 chi tall, and he didn't have the time to speak with Hung Jun. He was clad in metal armor, with the light of the stars flowing over his shoulders in a cloak. His fists and feet shot out like flowing water, exchanging several blows with the drought fiend in mere moments. The man's physique was well built and tall, and his movements were much slower than the drought fiend's, but the drought fiend tried several times to attack, only for that tall man to forcibly block those blows with his metal vambraces and shoulder pauldrons. Metal clashed incessantly against metal. The two of them exchanged several blows, before suddenly springing apart. The drought fiend's hoarse voice shouted, enraged, "You again." "Mom," a young voice suddenly called out. "Feng Er." A bolt of lightning shot through Hung Jun at the sound of that voice. Feng Er then ran out from the rocks to one side, dashing into Hung Jun's arms. That tall man said, "You guys leave, quickly. I'll slow him down." The drought fiend asked darkly, "Who exactly are you?" "Go," the man bellowed. Hung Jun pulled Chen Feng to his feet, and Chen Feng added, "Go this way. You know each other." Hung Jun went to help Ashinakayan up, and the three of them staggered behind the stone mountain. From behind came the drought fiend's voice, filled with rage. "Are you set on protecting him now?" "That's right, that man's clear," crisp voice said. "And you shall be but another defeated enemy of mine. Want to go again?" When Hung Jun left the stone mountain, he suddenly turned back, borrowing the light of the stars to study that man's countenance. The man was wearing a unique set of armor. It looked a little like Han armor and a little like Tang armor, but it was not either of them. The plates of his armor looked like the scales of a fish, but they did not cover his whole body. The silver scales only protected his left shoulder and arm, revealing a lithe, muscular arm, a well-muscled abdomen and arms, and muscular thighs bulging with explosive power. He gave off a feeling of masculine beauty. The only weapon he had was in his right hand, a silver hook glimmering with light that was pinned to his wrist with 4 points. The man's hair was tied into a high ponytail, and he had a silver mask on that hid half his face. On his feet he wore a pair of dragon-shaped boots. He looked somewhat like an assassin, and somewhat like a military commander. He also had a wound across his belly, which was seeping a little bit of fresh, red blood. It had mostly stopped by now, but it was evident that that was a new wound he had sustained during his fierce battle with the drought fiend earlier. Hung Jun glanced back, just as that man glanced at him. His eyes were bright, and they seemed to hold 1,000 words that he wanted to say, but instead, he bowed slightly before focusing all his attention on the drought fiend. His empty left hand sent them away from where it hung down by his side, meaning that they shouldn't worry and leave quickly. When Hung Jun and Ashinakayang left the stone mountain, the sky was already faintly brightening. The dawn sunlight appeared in the east, shining across the land. Hung Jun. Lu Su's voice sounded. We're saved. It was as if Hung Jun had lost all his strength. Qiu Yangxi came racing towards them, asking, how did you all get? Feng Er. Chen Feng glanced at Qiu Yangxi, before looking back at Hung Jun. Another roar came from within the stone mountain behind them, and their expressions all changed. Hung Jun immediately said, there's a friend still inside. We have to go back in and save him. Qiu Yangxi immediately added, Lu Su, protect Kayang. You all should go, Ashinakayang said. Don't mind me. There's no more enemies left, except for the drought fiend. Qiu Yangxi shouted, attack. Surround him. The group surrounded the drought fiend, and as soon as that silver-armored man saw that the exorcists had arrived, he did not charge forwards. Instead, he stepped in front of Hung Jun, on his guard just in case the drought fiend suddenly tried to attack Hung Jun. I'm all right. Hung Jun's wounds were already 70% healed. Moreover, the sun was slowly rising, and the shadows were shrinking across the land as the light crept towards the drought fiend. Stop! Qiu Yangxi roared. We don't need to be enemies. The drought fiend laughed coldly, before shouting, you all understand nothing. Hand that little peacock over. Otherwise you will all die here. Let's see if you have the ability to do so first, Lu Su replied coldly. Grotesque beast. The drought fiend hadn't yet noticed Lu Su before Lu Su appeared in front of him. He stepped on the drought fiend's knee before landing a wicked slap on this leathery corpse's face. The drought fiend immediately flew into a great rage and tried to grab Lu Su, but Lu Su somersaulted off his shoulder and flipped backwards. The drought fiend was instantly infuriated, and he ignored the people right in front of him as he turned to dash towards Lu Su. Within the exorcism department, Lu Su's ability to win against his opponent was the most powerful of them all. In the past, he had even discussed a technique composed of successive blows with Li Jinglong, Mo Rijin, and Qiu Yangxi. Lu Su would first use his speed to gain the upper hand, and as long as he could get close to any humanoid Yaoguai, without any warning, he would hit them with a slap. Mo Rijin had been hit by this several times, and he knew that this strategy was one that was truly humiliating. No matter if the opponent was a Yao or a human, if they were struck by the slap, they would immediately grow enraged and would not let Lu Su go at any cost. Lu Su would then take this chance to somersault behind the opponent, and as long as their opponent turned, their back would be exposed to the rest of the group. The rest of them could then attack with magic and achieve miraculous results. Hung Jun tossed out the Yao binding rope, and Qiu Yangxi dashed forward, sweeping his staff forward. When Lu Su retreated, however, the drought fiend was even faster, and he almost managed to split him open from shoulder to hip. Qiu Yangxi then used the devil subduing staff to hit the drought fiend. When he figured out the trick, the drought fiend turned. It was just then that the red sun rose in the east and shone into his eyes, forcing a pained cry out of him. He's afraid of sunlight. Qiu Yangxi shouted. Right now. Hung Jun took a half step forward, pulling out the Yao binding rope. A brilliant golden light coiled around the drought fiend, and Lu Su took this chance to retreat. The drought fiend began to fly away, trying to escape, but the silver-armored warrior next to Hung Jun leapt into the air, reaching out with one iron claw towards the drought fiend's head. The drought fiend bent backwards, and Hung Jun's Yao binding rope transformed into the sky-trapping net, coiling around him. The drought fiend fell heavily to the ground, and dust went flying every which way. End chapter.